Hello and welcome to the JW Thoughts channel. My name is Wally and today we are back looking at Watchtower 100 Years Ago. This is a series that I just started where we look back at some of Watchtower's older teachings, specifically the ones out of the Millions Now Living Will Never Die book, and compare that to what Jehovah's Witnesses say about those things then and what they teach currently. I find it quite interesting and I hope you guys enjoy it. Yesterday we did talk about the Zionist movement and how Watchtower had tied that to biblical prophecy, basically saying that the end was going to come when Israel and the Jews were able to reclaim Palestine as their homeland. And one thing I did forget to mention in that video, so just a quick correction, is that 1918 date that he did point to as being significant, prior to the Millions Now Living Will Never Die book, in Watchtower articles, they had said specifically that 1918 was going to be when the end actually came. There's quotes that you can look up. I believe JW Facts has an article on it, and it plainly, clearly says that the end is going to come, all of false religion is going to be done away with, we're going to be taken up to heaven, all of that classic language. So when he's mentioning 1918, it's kind of in this new light when it comes to the Millions Now Living Will Never Die. But we are going to be examining a few more quotes from Watchtower with regard to dates. Let's get into it. Alright, so let's jump straight away into it, and this will be on page 41. For more than 40 years, Pastor Russell, a faithful, consecrated Christian, proclaimed to the people by word of mouth, through the public press, and through his books, that 1914 would mark the end of the Gentile times, that the world would begin to end at that time, and that Messiah's kingdom would shortly follow. Now, a little bit to unpack here. Why does he mention for 40 years that he preached this? Was that just some arbitrary number that they picked out of nowhere? Well, not exactly. Most Jehovah's Witnesses don't even realize this, but they thought that Christ's presence initially began in 1874, and that 40 years after that, in 1914, that was when the end was going to come. And he actually acknowledges it right here. I'll just read it again. That 1914 would mark the end of the Gentile times, and that the world would begin to end at that time. So this was written a few years after 1914, and that, end time prophecy hadn't come true. But what they were doing in this book was finding the old classic new light. Well, it didn't end there, but it began to end. Rutherford, the current governing body members, they all do the exact same thing. Once one prediction fails, they just make tiny little adjustments until those become so ridiculous that they have to throw them out altogether. But I did find this interesting because it does actually hint at because he mentions the 40 years there. They used to think that Christ's presence began in 1874, and you'll find really no mention of that within Watchtower publications anymore. Now, notice how they really talk about some of these dates, and then we'll compare those to how modern day Jehovah's Witnesses talk about them. A few ministers here and there joined with him in the proclamation, but the majority of them scoffed at him and said all manner of evil against him because of his faithful proclamation of the message. The inspired witness of the Lord corroborated his statement that there would be scoffing at this time who would oppose the testimony divinely provided, saying, now just remember here, divinely provided. So what Rutherford is claiming here is that C.T. Russell's words were divinely provided, because this is all seen as the channel through which God dispenses his spiritual food to humans on earth. And then they go on to quote 2 Peter 3, 3-7, where it talks about in the last days there will be scoffers who walk around after their own lusts, blah, 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 blah. And how that was a fulfillment of prophecy when people called C.T. Russell crazy. The clear fulfillment of the above prophetic statement ought to be sufficient to convince any reasonable and thoughtful mind that we are now passing through the transition period from the old to the new order of things. These are very clear, definitive statements. Yes, 1914 marked the beginning. It was a process by which the end was going to actually take place. He gives some illustrations in this book about building a house or tearing a house down, how it's not just going to like, boop, be there, be gone, but it's progressive, so it takes a little bit of time in order for that to come about fully. Now, let's compare that with how Watchtower mentions these, and the example that came first to my mind was in the JV book, the Jehovah's Witness Proclaimers of God's Kingdom. That was like, when I grew up, that was like our little history book. So if you wanted to know the history of the organization, that was the thing to go to, and it was meant to be accurate and clear. But come to find out, they were trying to hoodwink me. Now that we can take off our blinders and no longer be hoodwinked, let's actually read some of these things with a clear mind. So on page, 134, it's talking about some of the end of the Gentile times and what the expectations were. So it talks about how the Herald in the Morning from Barber, how he talked about 1914 as well, and then C.T. Russell. He also picked up on that date, 1914, and began using it in the Millennial Dawn book and the Studies in the Scriptures. Wait, that was called. And then, was this before the Watchtower? I can't remember exactly. Anyway, this is what that JV book says on page 135. The Bible students were not completely sure what would happen. They were convinced that it would not result in a burning up of the earth and a blotting out of human life. Rather, they knew it would mark a significant point in regard to divine rulership. At first, they thought that by that date, the kingdom of God would have obtained full universal control. When that did not occur, their confidence in the Bible prophecies that mark that date did not waver. They concluded that, instead, the date had marked only a starting point as to kingdom rule. Now, this language is important here because they're using these terms. They thought. Evidently what they thought, that was their expectation. No, stop, you can't do that. That was what Rutherford called it, divinely provided. Any reasonable person would accept it. It is an absolute truth. It's a fact. So back then, they talked about these things not as, well, we think that something significant's going to happen in 1914. No, they said the end of the world is going to happen in 1914. And then Rutherford also just kind of affirmed that and said, yeah, the end of the world did start. We just haven't quite gone to heaven yet, as he called it. We're in that transition period. So I think that this is an important point to bring up to current Jehovah's Witnesses because, again, one of the most effective things is to show them their own literature. And I find this good because of encounters that I've had with my parents and asking them a question and them saying, well, I don't need to read any of the older publications because, the brothers now, the governing body now, the faithful slave now, they give us the important points that were taken from those things and can clarify things. And they, tell us what is in those old publications. Go look at the documentaries about how I can't remember the exact title of it now, but the faith and into the light, something like that. Anyway, you guys know the ones I'm talking about, and I'll probably put it on screen and post here anyway. But they can look at those and say, well, we trust that the Watchtower is accurately giving us the information. I think this is perfect, and I wish I had known and read Millions Now Living Will Never Die when I was having these conversations with my parents, because I could point to it and say, look, here's what it actually says. Okay? They give these definitive dates. The world did in fact end in 1914, and they were just in a tiny little transition phase. Pastor Russell was correct in his timelines. These Zionistic things, we're going to get into some more in the future days, but you could point to some of these very specific things and then say, okay, Watchtower is now claiming here in this Proclaimers of God's Kingdom book, which is better than their new history book, which is about that thin. You can tell they're whitewashing it as fast as they can. Hi, Zizi. And you can point to it and say, they're saying that, well, it was just a significant date. They didn't really waver in their confidence. It was just this starting point. That's not what happened, and you can read it for yourself. So can you honestly tell me that you trust that the governing body are giving you the right interpretation, the right breakdown of what was being said back then? Can you just say, well, we trust the governing body is going to, tell us the important points from those older publications? I don't think you can. And then it leads right into, why don't they make these things publicly available? We know for a fact that they have a database of all of their old literature, and it's digitized. And, we have some references that we can look up ourselves as well. Why don't they just allow people, make it just like jw.org? I think it's just a couple button presses away and everyone could have full access to all of this information. And I think it would be so powerful and important because then people could look it up for themselves. But back to the point, why are they telling you something? Oh, this is what they thought back then. And yet when you look for yourself, it's demonstrably not true. Those same people that are telling you a lie are also hiding the truth from you. They are hiding those old publications. They have access to them, and they're saying you cannot be trusted. You are too dumb and dim-witted to be able to read those older publications. I think it creates at least the thought of, wait, why don't we have access to those older publications? We have things that go back to Watchtower's 1952, and then the Awakes, don't they go back to the funny number 1969? But why don't they have access to that? And as a Jehovah's Witness, I know I was always annoyed that they didn't give people more access. As soon as I found out through my brother who was in Bethel that some of the Bethelites, depending on what your level was, had all of this extra access, and he showed me his version of the Watchtower library and how it had older stuff on there. I was like, wait, what the heck? And it drove me crazy that they were withholding information. Now that I'm out and I've realized there's a very specific reason why they're doing that. Anyway, I hope this video was interesting and useful. In tomorrow's video, I think we will talk about 1925 because, my God, was that a real whopper. I'll see you tomorrow.